Hello, everyone. Let's go around the Big Ten. I'm Marc Givler. We got Chip Minnich with me here. As always, a big rivalry weekend, which we recapped on Monday. That leads us into new playoff rankings, which we will talk about tonight. And we'll talk a little bit about signing day. This isn't generally a big recruiting show, but we will hit on it. It is my background, so I'm always cool with talking about recruiting. And then we'll get to our Penn State, Oregon prediction for the Big Ten championship game on Saturday night. But Chip, so the new rankings come out. Oregon number 1 is expected. Penn State number 3 probably is expected. Ohio State drops to 6. Obviously, that's going to be something to debate here in the coming days as conference championship games play out and kind of where Ohio State's going to fit in all this. Indiana moves up 1 spot to number 10, from 10 to 9, and that's really it in terms of the Big Ten. Illinois does come in at 21. Obviously, they are too far back at this point to make any type of college football playoff noise. But it seems like there's 4 teams from the Big Ten that are comfortably in, and we talked about this a few weeks ago. We said it was pretty much a lock if Indiana didn't, lose to Purdue, that the Big Ten will get 4 teams in. It looks like that's going to happen. Nothing super controversial there, but let's get into like Ohio State's ranking at 6. Like I've seen some people, a lot of it's Tennessee fans, so it's not exactly unbiased sources, complaining that Ohio State didn't fall far enough, that Tennessee should be ahead of Ohio State. I don't see any way from a resume standpoint you could ever possibly argue that. Ohio State's got better wins. They've got better losses. They look better in all the metrics you want to use. I think Ohio State is probably appropriately ranked right now. I think they had to probably be either 6 where they're at right now or even 5 ahead of Georgia. I think that's an interesting argument there with Ohio State and Georgia, and that will probably work itself out this weekend anyway. If Georgia loses, I suspect Ohio State's going to jump them. If Georgia wins, well, they're already ahead of Ohio State anyway, but I think they would have jumped Ohio State had they been reversed at 5 and 6. I think a Georgia win would have then bumped them ahead. So I don't think there's a whole lot to worry about there. But just your thoughts on the 6th spot for Ohio State. Was that appropriate? Was that not appropriate?
I think it was appropriate. I mean, I on this recording the other day, I was the person, and I'm not backtracking from it, about, maybe it would be better for Ohio State to not be a home playoff game. That was my thought a couple of days ago. I can't retract that. I will say that, newsflash, like big surprise, SEC fans are unhappy about, the fact that Ohio State is, in their estimation, is being rewarded and Tennessee and unjustly punished. And I agree with you. I think, when you look at Ohio State, and they had a clunker of a game versus Michigan. You can't sugarcoat it. You can't deny it. But the reality is Ohio State's resume, the strength of their schedule, when you look at it as objectively, and it's impossible for you and I or any other Ohio State fan to objectively look at it, Ohio State lost by 1 point to Oregon on the road. They lost by 3 to, let's face it, a mediocre Michigan team at home. They're 4 points away from being undefeated. I mean, Ohio State is one of the better teams in the country. Tennessee, on the other hand, is still one of the better teams in the country, but their resume by comparison to Ohio State is not as good. So that being said, if things stay the way that they possibly can, I know we're going to talk about the Big Ten championship here in a little bit. I think it's entirely possible that Ohio State will be a host team. And I think it's going to be interesting to see, I realize how busy you've been, with the recruiting and everything. It seems to me, based on what I saw and read from Ryan Day, that I think the team is kind of regrouping and reevaluating and trying to get into the right frame of mind, I should say, for an extended playoff run, and maybe a home playoff game versus a well-regarded SEC team might be just what the doctor ordered.
Just from a observer's perspective, I would love to see Tennessee at Ohio State at night in the first round. I think that would be just phenomenal television. I think the ratings would be through the roof. I think the hype around that game would be tremendous. But, we'll see how things shake out. As we've kind of said, it looks very good for Ohio State to get a home game. I don't even know what the path would be for them to not get a home game at this point. I really don't. You'd almost have to jump somebody ahead of them who doesn't play on Saturday. Like, I don't know what your criteria would be at this point to be able to move them all the way down to 9, given where you have them right now. So we'll see. But I think, it looks good for Ohio State. Looks good for Indiana to get in, right? I mean, they're kind of insulated right now. Seems like they're pretty solid. I know Alabama's kind of a controversial pick. I don't know how you separate them and Ole Miss. That's a tough call. Should Miami be higher? I don't think Miami is one of the 12 best teams in college football. Are they one of the 12 most deserving? I think that's a different discussion. And I've always said this has to be slanted toward deserving, or else why even play the games? We can just rate teams by talent in August and skip the regular season and have the playoff at that point. But, that's kind of a controversial thing there at the end of the rankings. But I think Indiana's insulated from all that.
Yeah. And I'm kind of, when it comes to Indiana, we talked about this previously. I'm not surprised that Indiana would be on the road. I believe, with the rankings at Georgia, if everything shakes out the way that, what we saw last night on Tuesday night in the rankings. So I think, for an Indiana fan, obviously you would want, I was just talking about the idea of having Georgia come to you, but let's face it. I think Indiana, their strength of schedule, we talk about it. And again, I'm not backtracking on it. You can only play the schedule you have, and Indiana was tremendously successful with the schedule they had, with the exception of their one loss at Ohio State a couple weeks ago. I mean, they bludgeoned their opponents. I mean, let's face it. You can say, oh, how good were the teams that they played. Hey, that's why they play the games. So Indiana did everything that they needed to do. I am glad to see that the committee seemingly is rewarding, like you said, insulating Indiana. I think that they're in. A question I have for you, and it's just more of, I think it'd be tremendous if Ohio State, I know the fans would be thrilled, the fact that the games are going to be on ESPN and TNT, at least for the first round. The question I would have is, would you prefer for a night game the Friday night or the Saturday night games? Because there's going to be 2 of them. My preference would be, just knowing Columbus and everything, would be for the Saturday night. Would be I'm not that I don't think that the good people of Columbus and the Ohio State fans around the country wouldn't make the trek, but I just think logistically it would be better to have it on the Saturday night if they do get the long desired night game in Ohio Stadium.
Well, I mean, I think for convenience for fans and everything else, Saturday night would be better. If I'm Ohio State, if I'm in that locker room, I want Friday night. I want the extra day of rest, because this is going to be a grind. If you're playing a first round game, this is going to be a grind. So I want every extra day of rest I can get. So I want to play Friday night, because you're going to get the few weeks off in between. But again, if you're a fan, you may feel differently about how you watch the game, if you can get to the game, whatever. That's obviously, there's a lot of factors that go into that in terms of Saturday night being more beneficial. But if I'm a player, if I'm a coach at Ohio State, I want the Friday night game. We'll see what happens there. With Indiana, it's funny. They're paired up with Georgia right now. And for me, there's I don't want to say a 0% chance, but it feels like there's a less than 5% chance that matchup actually happens, because either Georgia loses and probably falls behind, where you may get an Ohio State Indiana rematch, or Georgia beats Texas and they jump into the top 4 and get a bye. And then maybe you get Indiana at Texas. So I'm not even sure that matchup's going to has a really high percentage chance of even happening. But maybe it does. Maybe, who knows? Maybe Georgia would, if Georgia loses a close one to Texas, maybe they just stay. Maybe they just keep them there. And then, of course, there's also what happens with like Penn State and Oregon as well that can play into this. But it's interesting to me. Like I said, nothing super controversial for me as far as the Big Ten is concerned. Kind of about what I expected. I thought Tennessee would insulate Ohio State. I thought, one in front of Tennessee was as far as Ohio State could drop. You can't really argue for Tennessee ahead of Ohio State at this point. And Oregon was exactly where they should have been and expected to be. Penn State was exactly where they were expected to be. And then Indiana was pretty much exactly where they would have been expected to be as well. So nothing too crazy there. Now we just see how the Saturday goes and see how the matchups go. Because right now, I think Ohio State's game's going to be fascinating no matter what. It looks like they're going to either get Tennessee at home, which, again, great game. Two fan bases have been talking a lot of trash the last, day or two since the rankings came out about why Tennessee's ranked behind them and everything. And so you're going to get that, or you're going to get what I would call the Caleb Downs Bowl, which is you may very well get Ohio State hosting Alabama if certain things fall a certain way. So I think no matter what, that's going to be a major game of intrigue. I would also love to see Penn State, if they lose to Oregon, retain that home game and play someone like Alabama or Tennessee, because I was told on Twitter all year that any of these 2 and 3 loss or even 4 loss SEC teams would have no problems strolling into Happy Valley in December and beating Penn State by multiple touchdowns. So I want to see that actually happen, because I don't freaking think so. But we will see if that comes to fruition as well. So these matchups are going to be exciting. Elsewhere, the signing day today.
Yes.
Some stuff still going on out there. So
right.
It's like 90% done, but it's not like done. There's a couple guys signing tomorrow. There's some drama, as always, as happens with signing day. Some of the more interesting stories in the Big Ten. I think there was some Big Ten on Big Ten crime today on some big names. Oregon flips 5-star cornerback Naeem Offord from Ohio State. Auburn was also pursuing Offord and was considered a potential landing spot for him down the stretch here. And Ohio State flips Epi Stanley from UCLA. And that was like their crown jewel, their recruiting class. And Ohio State flips him after Ohio State lost a couple of decommitments at defensive end. And so there was some cross-country, like Big Ten friendly fire, I guess, today. Anything jump out to you today as far as Big Ten stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad that you brought that up. I mean, obviously the Offord decommitment was something that, let's face it, I mean, again, we're more in your wheelhouse. You and Kevin do this a lot more. I mean, it's been, will he, won't he? And it was more of, okay, is it going to be Auburn? And you, as it got closer and closer to today, like Oregon was one of those teams that you started hearing more and more about. So I'm happy for the young man. I guess, obviously he believes that Oregon is in his best interests. And, I'm one of these people that, all right, it's not my decision to make. Obviously would have preferred that he had stuck with the original Ohio State verbal commitment, but I mean, that's the decision that Naeem offered, or the direction he decided to go. I guess a name, not necessarily that it didn't come to fruition as being like, just to borrow your term, like the Big Ten on Big Ten crime, that Chaz Coleman, who I know, Ohio State had, some interest in, had, tried to get him to flip his commitment. He stuck with his Penn State commitment. So there's one that I guess I'm going to, I realize that recruiting, there's a lot more that goes into it than just on signing day, that the long-term development. So just to keep an eye, on a guy from Ohio, from Warren Harding, to see how he develops at Penn State. I'm not so surprised that it didn't come to pass based on everything that you and Kevin had been saying, but Jakeem Stewart went to USC, and Ohio State would have loved to have had him. But I guess this is just one man's opinion. I'm just kind of more surprised that it was USC and not LSU. That's kind of, I guess, of a surprise, as a kind of a recruiting person that follows the work that you and Kevin do, when it comes to, giving like the names of prospects that Ohio State is pursuing and trying to land.
Yeah. And like USC had some late buzz here the last week or so. If you would have told me like a month and a half ago he was going to pick USC, I would have never in a million years believed you. I would have thought they were running fourth behind LSU, Oregon, and Ohio State. But huge pickup for Lincoln Riley. Do they need it up front. That was a big thing. And then you have Zahir Mathis, who was committed to Ohio State, decommits from Ohio State. It doesn't look like he's going to sign today. I don't know if he's going to sign this week. He may not sign at all this cycle. He may sign late, which would be interesting because Ohio State has been trying to get him back. And Penn State's a school that's involved there, and Colorado's a school that's involved there. So there could be some upcoming. I mean, there might still be some Big Ten recruiting battles to play out yet. And Zahir Mathis would be a big one for Ohio State or Penn State, whichever one could get. If either one of them can pull that one off, that's a big late addition or re-addition if you're Ohio State. So that's something to watch here. But yeah, to your point with Jakeem, that was shocking. Based on where things were like a month and a half ago, USC kind of did pick up some steam late. Why that is, I'm not. Obviously, you're talking about a very big NIL package for a player of Jakeem's caliber. So maybe USC just was able to come away with the biggest and best there. But they need guys like that for sure to rebuild their defense. I'm looking at like the composite rankings right now. Like one site, 247's got Oregon 4, Ohio State 5, Michigan 7 in the team recruiting rankings, USC 13, Penn State 17. And then if you go over to On3, they've got Oregon 2, Ohio State 5, Michigan 6. And then they've got USC 14, Penn State 16. So everyone's pretty close. Nebraska 20. That's an interesting one. So everyone's, the two services there are pretty close. Maybe a team's off one or two spots from where the other one has them, but it looks like, they're in pretty good shape as a conference to sign 3 top 10 classes and, maybe as many as 5 top 15 classes, depending on how things shake out here. So, a solid class for USC. Is it going to get them back to national prominence? I'm not convinced of that. 13th isn't bad, but it's not, you're in Southern Cal. I mean, that's, you should be able to sign top 5 or 6 classes, I think, just about every year. Michigan's had a resurgence in recruiting this year. We can talk about at a later date when the NCAA does anything there, if that will affect their class, and that'll be a discussion point for whenever that news comes out. I'm not going to speculate on that too much. I don't know what the NCAA is going to do, how severe it's going to be, if it's not going to be severe at all, and how that could impact things. So until we know what they're doing, I'm probably not going to speculate too much on that. Probably a little bit irresponsible, but Oregon again, Ohio State again, considered pretty much consensus top 5 recruiting classes. And as I've kind of said before, I've kind of told the Ohio State fans that I speak with, like, don't be surprised, even though Michigan just beat them again, don't be surprised if this becomes a really big thing in terms of like every year you kind of have to go through Oregon at some point, whether it's in Indianapolis, regular season, whatever it is. Don't be surprised if every year it's a going through Oregon thing moving forward for a Big Ten championship, because those two programs continue to be set up nicely.
Yeah, I would completely agree. I would say right now, and obviously let's enjoy the remainder of the 2024 season, but I think it's almost impossible not to forecast Oregon being the proverbial, thorn in the side of Ohio State and the rest of the Big Ten, for the foreseeable future. I mean, just the way Dan Lanning, in terms of his coaching, I think obviously we're talking about the recruiting. I think the development is there. Obviously the NIL that Oregon is willing to distribute, let's face it. I mean, it's going to be one of these things that I think Oregon, for all of the traditionalists that are up in arms that, oh, like how could Oregon come into the Big Ten and not immediately be playing for the conference championship? Hey, they are taking advantage of a lot of the things that they had well established, as well as the fact that now that they are a national brand, taking advantage of these new rivalries and opportunities to impress young men coast to coast. So Ohio State, that if anything, it just means that they have to raise their game. A player that I neglected to mention in our previous, I guess I don't want to call it that here was somebody that I know that you're familiar with, that Kevin's familiar with, that probably, if things could have worked out in his favor, would have been an Ohio State Buckeye. But your thoughts on Nolan Davenport signing with Wisconsin, considering just the glaring need that Ohio State, Ryan Day acknowledged during the fact that offensive lineman is something that Ohio State needs. Like, was that a mistake to let Nolan Davenport go, even though he would be a developmental guy along the offensive line?
Yeah, it's interesting. You wonder, if Ohio State knew back in June that this was definitely going to be going to a 105 roster limit, and that, walk-ons are kind of going away and you could have up to 105 roster players and they could all be scholarship players if you want them to be, maybe they would have approached that a little bit differently. He camped at Ohio State in June. They didn't offer. They apparently told him after camp they probably weren't going to offer, at least not at that time. And he promptly, the very next day, committed to Wisconsin. So I think that tells you something about how that landed with him, how that conversation went. So I don't even know if they had come back at the last minute. I don't know how that would have been received, because he was obviously pretty upset with that by committing to Wisconsin the very next day. Yeah, I like Nolan. He's like one of my top 15, 20 guys in Ohio in the class. So that's right on that fringe of I'm not going to be stunned if Ohio State offers, and I'm not going to be against it if Ohio State offers, but I'm also not going to be super surprised if they don't. He's right in that kind of window for me. But I think where Ohio State's mind is at right now at offensive tackle is to go in the portal and get proven players, and then continue to fill out their depth with high school players. But we'll see. Also, David Sanders Jr. did not sign today. My opinion, my opinion is that he's going to ultimately stick with Tennessee.
I agree.
But it was kind of funny. Ohio State, with a very well timed and strategic news drop this morning, having Josh Simmons go out there and declare for the NFL draft at 9:30 this morning, while they're still making their last ditch effort to flip David Sanders from Tennessee, and be like, hey, just a reminder that our starting left tackle's leaving. Just wanted you to know that before you sign. So that was a nice little touch. But we'll see what the next 24 hours holds there. But yeah, it was a good signing, a good, Big Ten, well represented in the top 15, top 25 recruiting classes. Again, a lot of the services here have them. I believe have the Big Ten with 6 or 7 top 25 classes. Nebraska's in there, Washington's, Wisconsin. I think 8 on 247, 8 of the top 25,
right? 9
of the top 27, 10 of the top 30. Maryland and Rutgers sneaking in there. In Wisconsin at 25. So, 10 of the top 30 recruiting classes is very, very strong. Very strong for the Big Ten. So a really good signing day for them. Maybe when things get a little slower here, like next week, we can do a little more in depth on that and, pick out some surprise classes and things like that. But, last thing I want to get into here tonight is obviously the Big Ten championship game on Saturday night, Penn State and Oregon. Oregon, as the time of recording, only a 3.5 point favorite, Chip. That's low. I think people expected at least to be a touchdown. This is what's Vegas telling us here. Okay,
that's why I gave you that look, because obviously, the powers that be in Vegas, I always joke about, hey, there's a reason why there's beautiful, brand new, shining buildings always going up in Vegas. They know something that the average person doesn't. I'm just kind of surprised because I have the utmost respect for Penn State in the sense that I think defensively they're solid. We saw what, as an Ohio State fan, we saw what they did, Oregon did to Ohio State secondary. And no disrespect to Penn State's secondary. I just have a hard time envisioning Penn State secondary being able to do much better. Maybe strategically they will. Like I know Abdul Carter as a pass rusher, that is something that is going to be, something that Oregon will have to account for with Dylan Gabriel. But I think Oregon wins comfortably, more than by 3. That kind of, we talked about it earlier with regard to the playoff seedings. Like if Oregon were to boat race Penn State, which I don't think is going to happen, but if that were to happen, how much would that impact Penn State's standing in the college football playoff rankings? So I think Oregon wins by at least a touchdown. It wouldn't surprise me by 10. I just, the reason why I was kind of looking funny is that I just think 3 points. I think Oregon is definitely, especially it's indoors too.
Yep.
Let's not ignore that. I think that's an advantage for Oregon. So I think Oregon wins comfortably. Maybe you disagree.
No, like my brain tells me Oregon by like a touchdown. I think Penn State's better than their detractors say they are.
I agree with that.
That line is so weird to me. And I keep getting back. We've talked about this a lot, and we always seem to fall into the trap of like not fully buying into it. Is the cross-country flight? Are we going to have another cross-country flight issue? Because Indianapolis is obviously a much quicker flight, quicker trip, same time zone than Penn State. And, or so you're changing time zones again. You're flying across the country. Like, I wonder if that's being baked in. But yeah, I think Oregon's going to win. I think it's going to be a little more high scoring than people think. I think Oregon's going to win like something like 31-24, something like that would be my guess. I think that the indoor, fast turf, I think there's going to be some plays made. I think Penn State's going to try and control the line of scrimmage and play keep away with their running game. That's been successful at points against Oregon this year, but at points it hasn't been. They've seemed to have improved a little bit as the season went on in terms of holding up against the run. I think it's been a really good game. But yeah, I'll go Oregon as well. I
like that score. I like your score though. 31-24, like 31-21, something like that. Like it, that's what it feels like to me. I mean, like this is an opportunity, let's face it. Not that, because I think we're both in the same mindset on Drew Aller. I think he has his obvious, his obvious share of detractors. I think there are people that are expecting, from the Penn State side of things, that we're expecting more from him than what he has shown. So this is an opportunity for Drew Aller to show on a national scale what he can do. But by the same token, I think it's also important for if I was a Penn State offensive coach, like Drew, play within yourself. Like don't try to do too much against this team, because I do think Dan Lanning, having a defensive background, he's going to do things to try to intimidate and confuse Drew Aller. So I think it's going to be really important for Drew Aller to kind of just play whatever opportunities present themselves.
Yeah, and then just kind of like lastly here, I completely agree with you, but I think maybe more interesting, or at least just as interesting to me as the outcome of that game, is what it does to the playoff rankings.
Yep.
So here's how I have it. Obviously this can go one of 3 ways in my opinion. Path A is Penn State wins, and I don't care if that's by 1 or by 30. If that happens by any score, if Penn State wins, obviously they're going to vault up 2 at worst and maybe 1. And I think Oregon's basement is like 5. I don't think Oregon slips past 5. I don't think Oregon, no matter how bad they could lose on Saturday night, would fall behind Notre Dame or Ohio State. So I think they're kind of insulated there. Where it gets interesting is Penn State. Like if Penn State loses by a field goal, you've got some decisions to make. Notre Dame and Indiana on paper, if you take away the names, Notre Dame and Indiana on paper have essentially played the same schedule, and Indiana's loss is better. So that kind of showed, but their gap in the rankings is significant. So would you drop Penn State for losing a tough home game to Ohio State and then a tough neutral site game to Oregon? Would you drop them below Notre Dame, who lost to Northern Illinois and doesn't really have a whole lot of great wins? Like, would you do that? And furthermore, what would you do about Ohio State? Would you drop them below Ohio State? I mean, Ohio State beat them on their home field. So if they lose a close game to Oregon, what happens there? If they get blown out by Oregon, I think it's pretty simple. They drop behind Ohio State, and they maybe even drop behind Tennessee at that point, but definitely behind Ohio State. So there's like 3 different paths this can go that could shake up the bracket.
Right. I that's why, like, your score prediction, I think that falls neatly into, I'm just going to say, like, category B, right?
Yeah.
Like that, like, I don't think a touchdown or even a 10-point loss, like, let's say, like, just hypothetically that, okay, Oregon has the ball, it's late in the fourth quarter, they have the lead, and they kick a field goal just for insurance. I don't look at that as a, even like 10 points as a blowout loss. Right. So I agree with you. I think that, like, the scenarios you present, I mean, you want to talk about how the shockwaves that were felt if from Ohio State, the upset loss last week to Michigan. If Penn State pulls off the upset, I mean, I think, it's one of these things like, oh my gosh, like the reverberations. I do think, if I'm a Penn State fan, you're certainly hoping for category B, in the sense that, okay, most people are anticipating you to lose. You don't want to get blown out. You don't want to be embarrassed on national television. So I think if I'm Penn State, I think obviously you want to win the game, but you're hoping for the best case scenario and most likely scenario is category B.
Yeah. So we'll see. Like I said, I think the Big Ten championship game has a really big influence on what the final bracket looks like. Obviously, the SEC championship game will have its share of influence as well, with Georgia and Texas and that whole kind of build up, that parking lot of bumper to bumper traffic there between like 5 and 9 or whatever it is. The SEC will have some say in that as well, but I think the Big Ten is going to really have some say in how this the Big Ten championship game will have a real say in how this bracket is finalized. But hey, enjoy it. Saturday, it's one of the best days of the year.
Absolutely.
The conference championship weekend. I don't know how much longer we're even going to have it. Who knows what the playoff and all the complaining about the championship games is going to lead to in the future. So we'll enjoy them while we have them. Extra football, I never complain about it. So everyone enjoy your football watching this Saturday, and we'll see what happens. We'll be back here early next week to recap that, and we'll have the final playoff rankings when we do our next show. So we'll break down the bracket and do all sorts of that good stuff when the bracket is announced on Sunday night, right? Sunday evening,
Sunday afternoon. I think. Yeah, I think
you're right. It's always early. It's early afternoon. You want to get it over before the NFL games kick off.
Oh, ESPN, I think, has devoted 8 hours. I mean, well, it's not just the college football playoff. I mean, like, it's also the other bowl games.
Got to argue about the bowl game. You got to argue about things afterwards.
Absolutely.
So. All right, guys, that'll be it for this episode. We appreciate you guys watching and listening. And again, we'll see you on the other side here when we have the rankings to break down.
Bye.